Emma Parker stepped into the first-class cabin with an air of practiced elegance, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She barely acknowledged the flight attendants as she passed, her mind still buzzing from the day's endless stream of board meetings, urgent phone calls, and lavish but entirely unnecessary dinners. All she wanted now was a moment of quiet, a glass of champagne, and perhaps a few hours of sleep to reset herself before the next leg of her hectic schedule. As she reached her row, Emma's breath caught. Her seat was taken by a man, sitting comfortably in the aisle seat. His body angled slightly as he studied a stack of documents in his lap. He was dressed simply in jeans and a black jacket, his posture relaxed, seemingly unfazed by the first-class luxury surrounding him. Emma felt a twinge of irritation. She blinked, expecting him to notice her arrival and move or, at the very least, acknowledge her presence. Instead, he remained absorbed in his papers, completely indifferent to her existence. A strange, uncomfortable sensation crept up Emma's spine. There was something off about this scene, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It wasn't just that the man looked casual, almost out of place, with his understated attire and unhurried demeanor. It was something deeper, something she tried to dismiss but couldn't fully ignore. He didn't look like the kind of person she was used to seeing in first class. Emma shook off the thought as absurd, quickly scanning the nearby seats, hoping for a last-minute change in the seating arrangements. But the cabin was full. Resigned, she took her seat next to him, feeling an involuntary pang of resentment. The tension between them seemed almost tangible, though the man appeared completely oblivious, absorbed in his work as if he were alone. Emma's frustration simmered. She had paid thousands for this seat, and now, her first-class experience was tarnished by the quiet, unfamiliar presence beside her. Her eyes narrowed, and before she could fully think it through, she raised her hand, catching the eye of a blonde flight attendant with a practiced, professional smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the flight attendant asked, her voice polite but cautious. Emma's tone was clipped as she replied, "I'm supposed to sit next to him?" She tilted her head ever so slightly in the man's direction, her voice barely above a whisper but laced with unmistakable irritation. The flight attendant's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she replied. "Is there an issue with your seat?" Emma folded her arms, attempting to hold back her frustration. "I'd like to sit somewhere else." The flight attendant glanced around, a hint of tension creeping into her smile as she realized there were no other available seats. "I'm afraid we're fully booked, ma'am. We don't have any other seats to switch to." Emma's eyes narrowed further, and her voice dropped to a cold edge. "I'm a paying customer, and I expect to sit in comfort. This is unacceptable." The attendant hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Emma and the man beside her. Emma noticed, with growing irritation, that he hadn't looked up once, his eyes still focused on his documents, as though her displeasure were invisible, as though her presence were irrelevant. With a forced smile, the attendant murmured an apology and moved down the aisle, leaving Emma feeling trapped and dismissed. She shifted in her seat, crossing her arms tightly, feeling a mix of anger and discomfort she hadn't experienced in years. It was almost as if her frustration, her very sense of entitlement, was slipping, ignored by both the flight attendant and the man who sat quietly, undisturbed beside her. She stole another glance at him. He was flipping through his papers with a calm precision, his brow slightly furrowed, immersed in his work. The ease with which he occupied the seat only fueled her irritation, a subtle defiance that grated against her carefully curated sense of control. Emma stared out the window, determined to ignore him, to maintain the image of composure she prided herself on. But the quiet presence beside her wouldn't let her rest. The man had unsettled her, not by what he said or did, but by the way he was so at ease, so utterly comfortable in a space she felt was hers alone to command. She clenched her jaw. the cabin feeling stiflingly small. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her irritation simmering just beneath the surface. She could feel the tension pressing in on her, the frustration that had started as a small, ignorable itch now expanding, filling every corner of her mind. She was used to comfort, to accommodations made without question, and to having her world ordered just so. But now, here she was, sitting beside someone who felt out of place in her perfectly tailored life. And the frustration was growing with every passing second. Taking a breath to steady herself, Emma waved down the blonde flight attendant she had spoken to earlier, her hand raised in a crisp, determined motion. The flight attendant returned, her polite smile fixed, but there was a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Emma lowered her voice, though her annoyance was unmistakable. "I need to be moved," she said firmly, gesturing slightly toward her seatmate. She didn't want to make a scene. Emma Parker didn't make scenes. She simply had standards, and this seating arrangement didn't meet them. The flight attendant glanced nervously at the man beside Emma, her eyes flicking back to Emma with a quiet, professional hesitancy. "Ma'am, I'm terribly sorry, but as I mentioned before, the flight is fully booked. We don't have any other available seats." Emma's face hardened, her patience thinning. "You don't understand. I paid for this seat, and I expect a certain level of comfort." The flight attendant's smile wavered. "Of course, ma'am, but unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. If you'd like, I can offer you a complimentary drink, or perhaps an extra pillow to make your flight more comfortable." Emma barely managed to stifle a scoff. A drink? A pillow? She hadn't paid thousands of dollars for a first-class ticket to have her concerns brushed aside with meaningless gestures. She turned to the flight attendant, her voice low and clipped, dripping with barely concealed disdain. "I don't think you understand," she said, each word measured. "I am a loyal customer of this airline. I don't expect to be seated in this kind of situation." The attendant's eyes darted briefly toward the man beside her, who had yet to look up from his papers. He continued reading, his expression calm, unperturbed by the tension building beside him. It was as if her frustration didn't exist, as if she didn't exist. Her face flushed with irritation, a mixture of embarrassment and anger gnawing at her. "I truly apologize, ma'am," the flight attendant said, her voice a touch quieter now. "If it were possible to move you, I would, but we're at capacity. I assure you that all of our first-class passengers are valued customers. All of our first-class passengers." The phrase hung in the air, twisting into something bitter in Emma's mind. Was the flight attendant implying she was no different than anyone else here? That this man beside her was somehow equally deserving of the luxury she had earned? The very thought made her bristle. She glanced at the man again, noticing, with irritation, that he was entirely unaffected, still calmly reading. Each page turned with quiet precision. She couldn't stand it any longer. Turning back to the flight attendant, she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper, but her tone sharp as steel. "I'm a paying customer, and I expect service that reflects that. Can you move him?" She didn't care that her words bordered on cruel. She needed the situation fixed, needed to reestablish the control that had slipped away the moment she'd entered this cabin. The attendant's face flushed, and she looked genuinely uncomfortable, casting another uncertain glance at the man beside Emma. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, professional. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't do that." Emma felt a surge of heat rise in her chest, the pressure building like a wave that she could no longer hold back. Her patience snapped, and her voice rose just slightly, the indignation boiling over. "Do you even know how much I paid for this seat?" There was a quiet stir from the rows ahead, a few passengers glancing back with curious expressions, sensing the tension. But Emma didn't care. She had come this far. She wasn't backing down now. The flight attendant's voice softened, her tone placating but resolute. "I assure you, ma'am, that every passenger in first class paid for their seat and is here by right. Emma's pulse quickened, her hands clenching tightly in her lap. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Couldn't believe she was being forced to sit here, trapped beside this stranger, with no one willing to understand her discomfort. And then, as if sensing her anger, the man beside her finally looked up. His gaze met hers with a calm, unruffled steadiness, a polite smile softening his features. He seemed to consider her for a moment before speaking, his voice deep and smooth, but measured. "Is there a problem?" Emma's mouth opened, then closed, her words momentarily caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to speak, hadn't expected him to meet her gaze with such quiet confidence, without a trace of resentment or frustration. It threw her off balance, left her feeling exposed, as though the power she had wielded so easily had slipped through her fingers. She managed a cold, dismissive smile, shaking her head as she forced her voice to remain steady. "No problem at all," she replied, her tone laced with a hint of sarcasm. She turned away, fuming, her mind racing, unable to shake the feeling that, somehow, she had already lost. As the flight settled into a steady rhythm, Emma found herself locked in a battle she hadn't anticipated. One not of words, but of silence. The man beside her had returned to his papers, unfazed by the tension radiating from her, and the cabin around them had settled into quiet. Still, Emma couldn't calm the turmoil churning within her. She tried to ignore him, her eyes fixed on the in-flight magazine in her lap, flipping through pages she barely saw. But her focus kept slipping, her gaze drawn to him calm, unbothered, as if her agitation was a breeze that couldn't reach him. His very presence beside her was like an itch she couldn't scratch, a reminder of the uncomfortable realization gnawing at her. He hadn't done anything wrong. Her anger, her demand to be moved, they were things she had created. Yet, every time he adjusted his papers or shifted in his seat, she felt a rush of annoyance, as if his very calmness was an affront. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, studying him when she thought he wouldn't notice. He wasn't wearing anything flashy or expensive, just a simple jacket, a crisp white shirt, and jeans. It was baffling to her. The people she knew in first class were always dressed to impress, a showcase of wealth and status. Yet, here he was, sitting as though the seat had been made for him, undisturbed by her presence, unruffled by her irritation. She forced herself to look away, feeling a mix of frustration and something darker, something she didn't want to acknowledge. It was as if he held up a mirror she hadn't asked for, one that showed her something she didn't want to see. She had never questioned her place in the world before, had never doubted that the privileges she enjoyed were anything but deserved. But now, sitting beside him, her entitlement felt raw, exposed in a way that stung. The flight attendant returned, offering drinks with a gentle smile. Emma seized the opportunity, ordering a glass of champagne with a tight-lipped nod. She hoped the drink would calm her, smooth the edges of her growing frustration. As the attendant handed her the glass, she caught the man's eye briefly and offered him a polite, strained smile. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, she felt as if he saw straight through her, saw the frustration, the entitlement, and the discomfort that was beginning to unravel her composure. She quickly looked away, sipping her champagne, feeling the bubbles sting her throat. Her heart was still racing, her mind whirling with questions she couldn't quite grasp, emotions she couldn't quite name. She wanted him to react, to do something, anything that would justify her irritation, her discomfort, but he remained infuriatingly composed, his attention returning to his papers as if she were no more than an afterthought. The minutes crawled by, the silence between them thick and charged. Emma could feel her carefully maintained facade slipping, feel the tension rising inside her like a tide she couldn't hold back. She was used to being in control, used to dictating the terms of every interaction. But here, beside a man who seemed impervious to her presence, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Small, The realization made her bristle. She didn't want to be affected by him, didn't want to care about his calm or his unspoken challenge. She didn't want to think about why his very existence in this seat beside her felt like a rebuke. She downed the last of her champagne, setting the glass aside with more force than she intended. But he didn't so much as glance in her direction. Emma's hands clenched in her lap, her pulse thrumming with a mixture of anger and helplessness. It wasn't just that he ignored her. It was the effortless way he did it, the quiet dignity that seemed to settle around him like armor. It made her feel vulnerable, as though her anger and frustration were small, trivial things in the face of his calm. She turned to the window, watching the sky outside, the clouds stretching endlessly across the horizon. But even the view couldn't soothe the restlessness within her. The silence between them felt heavy, oppressive, and no matter how she tried to distract herself, her thoughts kept circling back to him. This man beside her, whoever he was, had managed to dismantle something in her without saying a single word, and that, more than anything, left her feeling raw, exposed in a way she hadn't been in years. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm when a voice crackled over the intercom, capturing the attention of the passengers. Emma looked up, surprised at the interruption. It was the captain, his voice steady and professional, yet laced with a touch of excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to extend a special welcome to one of our esteemed passengers this evening," he announced. "We're honored to have Mr. Marcus Johnson, the owner and CEO of this airline, flying with us tonight. Mr. Johnson, on behalf of the entire crew and staff, thank you for your leadership and vision. It's a privilege to have you on board." Emma felt as if the ground had dropped from beneath her, leaving her suspended in a free fall of shock and disbelief. The man beside her, the man she had judged, dismissed, and silently resented, was the owner of the airline. Her mind scrambled to process the words, each syllable landing with a heavy weight. Marcus Johnson. The name echoed in her mind, a sudden and stark reminder of her own ignorance. She turned to look at him, almost as if she were seeing him for the first time. He hadn't reacted to the announcement at all. He simply nodded politely in acknowledgement of the captain's words, his expression calm, almost humble, as if this kind of attention was just another part of his day. Emma's heart pounded, her chest tightening with a mixture of shock and shame. She remembered every snide thought, every assumption she'd made about him, about his place here, about whether he belonged. Each one hit her like a blow, reverberating with a guilt that felt sharp and immediate. She had treated him as though he were an intruder in a space she considered hers, never once imagining that it was he who truly belonged here. He turned slightly, catching her wide-eyed stare, and she quickly looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. Her mind raced, scrambling for an excuse, a way to rationalize her behavior, but every excuse felt hollow, insubstantial in the face of what she now knew. Her own words, her demands to be moved, echoed in her mind, twisting painfully with the realization of how wrong she had been. The silence stretched between them, but now it felt different, heavier, charged with the weight of everything she'd assumed, everything she'd tried to impose on him. She felt exposed, as though he could see every judgment she had made, every inch of entitlement that had driven her actions. She wanted to say something, anything to break the oppressive silence, but words failed her. What could she possibly say? How could she explain away her assumptions, her need to control and impose, when the truth of her prejudice was now so painfully clear? As if sensing her turmoil, Marcus glanced at her with a small, polite smile, his gaze calm and understanding. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but unwavering. Emma's mouth went dry. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't even think. She managed a weak nod, though her mind was reeling, her thoughts a tangle of shame and regret. Here was the man she had tried to dismiss, who had quietly endured her contempt with a grace she hadn't deserved. And now, he was asking if she was all right. "Yes," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. Not at all. Her thoughts spun, the embarrassment settling over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, the quiet judgment in their glances. And at the center of it all was Marcus, calm, dignified, and entirely unruffled by the scene she had made. He didn't need to say anything to humble her. His mere presence was enough, his quiet composure highlighting every flaw, every prejudice she had been too blind to see in herself. Emma turned away, staring out the window, her cheeks burning. She felt trapped, not by her seat or the man beside her, but by the painful, unavoidable truth of her own behavior. She had been so quick to judge, so ready to believe that her status entitled her to something that others didn't deserve. The plane continued its course, the cabin lights dimming as the sun began to set outside, casting the clouds in shades of gold and violet. But the beauty of the view couldn't reach her, couldn't ease the knot of shame tightening in her chest. She had come onto this plane confident, secure in her place in the world. Now, all of that felt small, insignificant, shattered by the quiet dignity of the man beside her. As the flight attendants moved through the aisle, Emma barely noticed them, her mind consumed with her own self-reflection. The irony was undeniable. She, who had always believed herself to be superior, had been put in her place by the very man she had looked down upon. And it wasn't through anger, confrontation, or accusation. It was simply through the strength of his character, a strength that exposed the weakness in her own. For the first time in years, Emma felt truly humbled. The minutes felt like hours as Emma sat in silence, wrestling with her thoughts. Every time she glanced at Marcus, the shame tightened its grip on her, a weight pressing down on her chest that she couldn't ignore. She kept replaying the captain's announcement, the shock of realizing who Marcus truly was, and her own cringe-worthy reactions that now seemed to echo mockingly in her mind. How could she have been so wrong? How could she have let her assumptions control her so easily? An apology hovered on her lips, but each time she opened her mouth, the words died in her throat. Emma Parker didn't apologize, at least, not genuinely. Apologies, in her world, were a currency to smooth things over, a tool to control outcomes. But this felt different. Marcus wasn't just anyone, and this wasn't just a small misstep. What she had done, how she had treated him, it wasn't something she could undo with a simple "I'm sorry." But she had to try. Taking a deep breath, Emma turned toward him, her heart racing. She had never felt this kind of vulnerability, this uneasy mix of nerves and regret. Marcus looked up from his papers, his calm, steady gaze meeting hers. His face revealed nothing, but she felt his eyes searching her, waiting. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Emma felt small under someone's gaze, exposed in a way that stripped her of her usual poise. "Mr. Johnson." Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost a whisper. She swallowed, trying to gather her words, her pride clashing against the need to say something real. "I wanted to apologize. For earlier, I realized that I was out of line." Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable, though his eyes held a spark of curiosity. She could feel the weight of his attention, and it made her heart hammer even faster. This wasn't going how she'd expected. He wasn't giving her any easy path. No quick dismissal that would allow her to escape the discomfort she had created for herself. Emma looked down, unable to hold his gaze, her hands twisting together in her lap. I made assumptions," she continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "About you, about who you are. And it was wrong. I can't believe I acted like that. But She hesitated, the excuses she'd rehearsed earlier sounding thin and hollow now. "I was frustrated. But that doesn't make it okay." Still, Marcus said nothing. His silence felt heavier than any response he could have given, drawing her deeper into her own discomfort, forcing her to confront the truth of her actions without the safety of a quick forgiveness. She wished he would speak, wished he would say something to ease the burning regret that was coiling tighter in her chest. Finally, Marcus nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "Thank you for the apology," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But what's more important than apologizing to me is asking yourself why you felt the way you did." Emma blinked, his words cutting through her like a blade. She had expected him to accept the apology and move on, perhaps with a small, polite nod. But this was different. He was asking her to examine herself, to look past the surface of her regret and delve into the uncomfortable truth underneath. It wasn't an easy, transactional exchange of words. He was holding her accountable in a way that no one ever had. Marcus continued, his voice calm and steady. "We all carry assumptions, Ms. Parker. We all have biases, things we believe without even realizing. It's part of being human. But if we don't face those things, if we don't question them, they end up defining us." Emma felt her cheeks flush, a wave of guilt and embarrassment washing over her. She had spent her entire life believing she knew who she was, that her success, her wealth, her influence were enough to give her authority over others. But Marcus's words stripped all of that away, leaving her feeling raw, unsteady, as if she were standing on ground that had suddenly shifted beneath her. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she knew he was right. Her assumptions, her entitlement, they had shaped her, had driven her actions. And now, sitting here beside a man she had judged without cause, she felt the weight of those assumptions crashing down on her. Marcus's gaze softened, a hint of understanding in his eyes that only made her shame feel sharper. "I'm not offended by what happened," he said, his voice gentle but resolute, "because I know it wasn't really about me. It was about you." The words struck her like a blow. She had come here thinking she could simply apologize, pay her dues, and move on. But he was offering her something far deeper, a mirror, a chance to see herself in a way she never had before. And that terrified her. For the first time, Emma found herself questioning not just her actions but her own beliefs, her own sense of self. It was as though Marcus had opened a door she hadn't even known was there, a door into parts of herself she had always ignored, or perhaps never recognized. She looked at him, her heart pounding, unable to find the right words. And yet, for the first time, she didn't feel the need to speak. She sat in silence, letting the weight of his words settle over her, feeling their truth seep into the cracks of her carefully crafted world. Marcus turned back to his papers, his expression calm once more, as though their conversation hadn't just unraveled something fundamental within her. But Emma remained still, her mind racing, the silence around her suddenly feeling different, no longer oppressive, but full of possibilities she couldn't yet understand. She realized, with a pang of clarity, that this flight was not the inconvenience she had thought it to be. It was a reckoning. And as the plane continued its journey through the night, Emma Parker sat in quiet reflection, knowing that she was, for the first time, beginning to confront the person she truly was. The hours passed, but Emma couldn't shake the weight of Marcus's words. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice, calm and steady, urging her to question her own beliefs. She felt as if her very foundation had been cracked open, exposing parts of herself she hadn't wanted to see. She had spent years building an image of herself, a woman of power, success, and status. But sitting here beside Marcus, she was forced to face the uncomfortable truth of how easily that image crumbled. The flight attendant returned with a second glass of champagne, but Emma barely touched it. She could feel her pulse quicken each time she dared to glance at Marcus, who sat beside her with an unshakable calm, his focus unwavering as he flipped through his papers, absorbed in his work. It was as if her discomfort, her turmoil, had no impact on him at all, and that, she realized, was exactly the difference between them. He didn't seek validation or control in the way she did. His power came from within, grounded in an assurance she had never understood. She took a breath, summoning the courage to speak again. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice softer, unsure. She wasn't used to this feeling, this vulnerable need to understand. How do you do it? He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers, a trace of surprise flickering across his face. Do what? He asked, his tone as gentle as before. She hesitated, searching for the right words. How do you stay so calm? She asked, feeling the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. When someone treats you unfairly, or when people make assumptions about you, how do you just let it go? Marcus studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. He placed his papers aside, turning his full attention to her. I've learned, Ms. Parker, that we can't control how others see us or what they assume. People will carry their own biases, their own fears, but what I can control is how I respond to them. Emma felt a strange pang in her chest, a mixture of envy and admiration. She had always felt the need to respond, to defend herself, to establish her authority. But Marcus's approach was different, grounded in a quiet strength that didn't require validation from anyone else. But doesn't it bother you? She pressed, her voice barely a whisper. Doesn't it make you want to prove them wrong? Marcus leaned back, a small, thoughtful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. There was a time when it did, he admitted, his gaze distant, as if remembering another life, when I felt that I had to prove myself, to make people see beyond their assumptions. But I realized, after a while, that trying to change how others saw me only gave them power over my life. I was living in response to their expectations, not my own truth. His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and heavy. Emma felt a flicker of understanding, but the lesson was a bitter one to swallow. She had built her entire life around the expectations of others, around projecting an image that commanded respect. She had never stopped to consider that she might be shackled by those very expectations. So, you just let it go? She asked, her voice wavering, the vulnerability sharp and painful. Marcus's eyes softened, a warmth in his gaze that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. It's not about letting go. Exactly, he replied. It's about deciding what matters. I choose to put my energy into things that build me up, things that make a difference, not into battles I can't win. If I allow someone else's prejudice to define my actions, then I'm giving them control over me. Emma looked away, her mind whirling. She had always thought of herself as strong, as someone who demanded respect. But hearing Marcus's words, she realized that her strength had always been fragile, dependent on external validation. The respect she sought was conditional, something she felt she had to assert rather than earn. So, what does give you strength? She asked, her voice quiet but filled with a curiosity she hadn't felt in years. Marcus smiled, the expression warm and genuine. Purpose, he answered simply. I know why I'm here, and I know what I want to accomplish. When you're rooted in purpose, the little things don't shake you. The insults, the assumptions, they lose their power when you're focused on something bigger than yourself. Emma's throat tightened. Purpose. The word resonated within her, yet felt foreign, like something she had once known but had long since lost. She had always defined herself by her success, her wealth, her reputation. But sitting here beside Marcus, she felt the emptiness of those things, the hollowness of a life built on external markers. Do you ever feel like it's lonely? She asked, surprising herself with the rawness of her question. She hadn't intended to reveal so much, to expose her insecurities to a man she had, just hours earlier, tried to dismiss. Marcus's gaze softened further, and he nodded. Sometimes, he admitted, his voice quiet, but that's part of the journey. Growth often feels lonely because it forces us to leave behind the things, and sometimes, the people that don't align with our path. But when you live by your own principles, when you define yourself by what matters to you, you find a strength that lasts, and you'll find people who respect you not for who they think you are, but for who you truly are. Emma felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye, a small betrayal of the emotions she had been holding back. She quickly looked away, not wanting him to see the vulnerability etched across her face. But Marcus had already seen it, and there was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. They sat in silence for a while, the words hanging between them like a bridge, connecting two people who, hours earlier, had seemed worlds apart. Emma felt something shift within her, a faint but unmistakable yearning to understand herself, to find that strength and purpose Marcus had described. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, hope that she could change, that she could find a purpose beyond the walls she had built around herself. And as the plane continued its quiet journey through the night, Emma found herself sitting not just beside Marcus Johnson, the CEO, but beside a man who had shown her the possibility of something more, a life defined not by assumptions, power, or control, but by quiet dignity, purpose, and true strength. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight moved into the quiet hours of the night, and Emma found herself lost in thought, replaying the conversation with Marcus over and over in her mind. She had never questioned her life or her beliefs in this way. Sitting beside him, she felt her carefully constructed world shift, as if he had handed her a key to a door she'd never realized existed, a door to parts of herself she had never truly examined. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind drifted back through memories, moments that now felt shaded with a new, uncomfortable clarity. She thought of the times she had dismissed people based on their appearance, their backgrounds, even their demeanor. How many people had she written off simply because they didn't fit her narrow view of who belonged? The thought was unsettling, a knot tightening in her stomach. Emma opened her eyes, glancing at Marcus beside her. He was resting with his head leaned back against the seat, his eyes closed, his expression calm. There was a strength in his silence, a quiet confidence that seemed so natural, so different from the manufactured confidence she had always projected. She envied him for it. His power wasn't loud or forceful. It simply was. The hum of the plane filled the silence between them, but Emma felt as though they were still in conversation. She could almost hear his words echoing in her mind. I choose to put my energy into things that build me up, things that make a difference, not into battles I can't win. A part of her resisted his words. She had spent her life fighting, building her reputation, asserting her place in the world. She had thrived on control, on the power that came with her wealth and success. But now, those things felt insubstantial, like sand slipping through her fingers. If all of it, the money, the status, the power, didn't truly matter, then what did? She thought of the people in her life, the friends who were more like business allies, the family gatherings she attended out of obligation rather than love. When had her world become so empty? She had chased success for so long that she'd lost sight of why she was running. It was as if she'd been on a treadmill, sprinting toward a finish line that never truly existed. Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her. Her gaze drifted back to Marcus. How had he come to this place of peace? This unshakable sense of self? She could see now that it wasn't just success that had built him. It was something deeper, something that went beyond what she had spent her life striving for. Unable to resist, she leaned slightly toward him and whispered, Marcus. He opened his eyes, blinking slightly as he adjusted to the dim light, and turned to face her, his gaze steady and attentive. Yes, I've been thinking about what you said. She hesitated, unsure if she could truly open up to a stranger. But somehow, with Marcus, the vulnerability felt less terrifying, more necessary, about purpose, about not letting others' opinions define you. He nodded slowly, as if he understood the struggle within her. It's not easy, he said softly, especially when we've spent so much time living by those opinions. Emma felt the truth of his words like a wound, a raw place she'd kept hidden even from herself. I think, she swallowed, trying to find the right words. I think I've spent my whole life doing that, building a life around what others expect, proving myself, proving that I deserve everything I have. But now, her voice trailed off, a quiet desperation seeping through. Marcus waited, his silence patient, inviting her to continue. But now, I feel like I've been running toward something that doesn't really exist. Like I've been holding onto a version of myself that isn't real. She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. It's terrifying. I don't know who I am outside of all this. The admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Emma wasn't sure if she had ever been this honest with anyone, let alone herself. Marcus's gaze softened, his expression one of understanding, not pity. That's the first step, Emma, he said gently, recognizing that feeling, facing it. The rest, well, it's a journey. It takes time. She nodded, her throat tight, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. Part of her wanted to retreat, to push these thoughts away and return to the safety of her familiar life. But she knew, deep down, that going back wasn't an option anymore. Not after this. How do I change? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How do I find what actually matters? Marcus looked at her, and for a moment, she felt as if he were peering into her very soul. Start small, he replied. Look for the things that give you peace, that make you feel connected. Could be anything, a passion, a relationship, a sense of purpose that goes beyond yourself. The journey isn't about becoming someone new. It's about uncovering who you already are. Emma felt her eyes sting, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. But Marcus simply offered her a reassuring nod, as if to say it was all right, that the journey she was on was one worth taking. They sat in silence for a few moments, the soft hum of the plane their only backdrop. But the silence was different now. Not the charged silence of earlier, but something warmer, something that felt almost like an embrace. Emma let herself settle into it, letting the stillness calm her racing thoughts. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to change. She could let go of the fear, the need for control, the endless drive to prove herself. She could let herself be enough. As she closed her eyes, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. The journey ahead was unknown, uncertain, but she was ready to face it. And as the plane continued its quiet path through the night sky, Emma Parker felt, for the first time, a glimmer of who she might truly be. The captain's voice broke through the gentle hum of the cabin, announcing their descent into New York. Emma's heart quickened as she listened, the city lights below flickering like scattered stars, a reminder that soon she would be stepping back into her world, a world that suddenly felt foreign, even suffocating. As the plane began its slow, steady descent, Emma glanced over at Marcus, feeling a pang of sadness that surprised her. He was gathering his papers, stacking them neatly with the same calm precision she had come to expect from him. She realized, with a start, that she didn't want this to end. Not the flight, not the quiet revelations, and not the presence of the man who had, in just a few hours, altered the course of her life. The flight attendant appeared, making her final rounds, and Emma watched as she paused to speak to Marcus. Her smile was warmer, more genuine than the one Emma had received earlier, as if Marcus's quiet presence brought out a softer side in everyone around him. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," the attendant said, her tone laced with a subtle deference. "It was an honor having you on board with us." Marcus offered a small nod, his eyes crinkling in a polite smile. "Thank you for your kindness," he replied, his voice as calm and steady as ever. The simplicity of his gratitude struck Emma. It wasn't flashy or performative. It was just genuine. Watching him, she felt a strange ache in her chest, a longing for something she couldn't quite name. As the attendant moved on, Emma turned to him, her hands twisting together in her lap. She knew this was her last chance to speak. her last opportunity to express the gratitude and the humility that had been building within her since they first boarded. "Marcus," she began, her voice catching slightly. He looked up, his gaze steady and patient, as if he had known all along that she had more to say. I just wanted to say thank you, not just for listening, but for everything." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I didn't realize how much I needed this. How much I needed someone to help me see things differently." Marcus regarded her for a long moment, his gaze filled with a warmth that made her feel truly seen. "Emma," he said gently, "sometimes we meet people for a reason, to challenge us, to push us to see beyond ourselves. You already have everything you need to change. You just have to let go of the things that don't serve you." The words settled over her, profound and simple, like a quiet truth she'd known all along but had never dared to face. She nodded, her eyes stinging as she looked down, the weight of his words pressing into her chest. "Thank you," she whispered again, the words holding more weight than she could express. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also hopeful. It was a fragile feeling, delicate and new, but it was there, a spark she wanted to carry with her. As the plane touched down with a gentle jolt, the lights of the runway streaked past, casting soft, fleeting shadows across their faces. Emma watched as Marcus calmly prepared to leave, his movements unhurried, his expression peaceful. She wished she could hold onto this moment, this connection, but she knew it wasn't hers to keep. It was simply a gift, a reminder of what she could become. The cabin doors opened, and passengers began gathering their belongings, the energy of arrival buzzing around them. Emma felt a pang of anxiety as the realization sank in. This moment was ending. Soon, she would return to her life, her world of boardrooms and business deals, of perfectly curated appearances and carefully maintained walls. But now, she thought, maybe it didn't have to be the same. She stood, reaching for her carry-on, and found herself turning back to Marcus one last time, a question lingering in her gaze. She wanted to know if she would see him again, if there was some way to keep this connection alive. But Marcus seemed to sense her thoughts, and he offered her a gentle smile that seemed to say he understood. "Take care, Emma," he said, his voice warm but final, a quiet encouragement wrapped in a farewell. "Remember, it's not about changing everything at once. Just start with one thing that matters." Emma swallowed, nodding, feeling her throat tighten with an unfamiliar mix of gratitude and loss. "I will," she promised, her voice barely above a whisper, and she meant it. She felt a certainty in those words, a sense of commitment she hadn't felt in years. As he turned and walked down the aisle, disappearing into the crowd of passengers, Emma felt a strange, quiet peace settle over her. She took a deep breath, letting the feeling fill her, holding onto it as she stepped into the bustling terminal. The world outside was loud, chaotic, and filled with the relentless energy of the city. But as she walked through the terminal, Emma felt different, as if she had left part of her old self behind on that plane. The rush of people, the flashing lights, the announcements echoing through the hall, all of it faded into the background as she moved forward, her mind still holding on to Marcus's words, like a compass pointing her in a new direction. This wasn't the end, she realized. It was the beginning, a beginning she had never anticipated, but one she now welcomed with open arms. She would go back to her life, but she would carry with her the lessons she had learned, the glimpse of a deeper, more meaningful way of being. She would start small, as Marcus had said. She would search for the things that truly mattered. And as Emma stepped out into the bright lights of the city, she felt the weight of her old self lifting, leaving her with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't just living by the standards of others. She was stepping into a life that she, herself, was ready to define. The taxi ride into the city was filled with a silence that was somehow comforting. Each turn and stoplight a quiet rhythm that allowed Emma to reflect on the whirlwind of emotions from the flight. She stared out the window, watching the lights of New York blur past. But her thoughts were elsewhere, circling back to Marcus's words, to the gentle, unyielding wisdom he had imparted. It was as if a new part of her had been awakened, one that she couldn't ignore, and she knew she didn't want to return to the person she had been just hours before. By the time she reached her apartment, a sleek high-rise overlooking the city, Emma felt both exhausted and energized, a strange combination that she couldn't quite understand. She stood at the window, gazing at the cityscape, her mind drifting back to every choice she'd made to bring her here, the relentless ambition, the drive to prove herself, the constant need for control. Those choices had once felt empowering, a badge of her success, but now they felt hollow, as if they were pieces of someone else's life. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep remained elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's calm, steady gaze, heard his quiet encouragement to focus on one thing that matters. The simplicity of it struck her. Her life had always been about complexities, deals, negotiations, ambitions, relationships that were more strategic than genuine. But now, she found herself wanting simplicity, a purpose that resonated beyond the walls of her office. The next morning, Emma woke early, the sunlight streaming through her curtains casting a warm glow across her room. Felt different, brighter somehow, as if the world had shifted in subtle ways. She took a deep breath, feeling an unfamiliar sensation, a strange, hesitant hope, the kind that came from knowing change was possible. She went to her closet and pulled out her usual attire, a sharply tailored suit, elegant and immaculate, the kind that projected power with every stitch. But as she held it in her hands, felt wrong, like a costume. Instead, she chose a simple blouse and comfortable pants, something she hadn't worn in years, something that felt real. Today wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about reconnecting with herself. Emma's first step was to go for a walk through Central Park, a small act that, just yesterday, would have seemed pointless, even indulgent. But as she walked along the winding paths, surrounded by trees and the soft hum of city life, she felt her mind quiet. The usual noise, the urgency that had been her constant companion, began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She sat on a bench, watching a group of children play nearby, their laughter echoing across the park. She realized how much she had missed these simple moments, the small joys she had once considered trivial, too unimportant to occupy her valuable time. But now, those moments felt rich, meaningful, like glimpses of something she had forgotten to cherish. With a sudden clarity, Emma reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, her finger hovering over familiar names. Friends she hadn't seen in years, family members she had drifted from, colleagues she had once confided in but had since lost touch with. These were people she had once cared about, people she had once let in, before her world had become a fortress of ambition. She took a deep breath and tapped on one name, her sister's. It had been months since they'd last spoken, and even then, their conversations had been brief, obligatory exchanges. As the phone rang, Emma felt a surge of nerves, but beneath it, there was a sense of excitement, too, a hope that perhaps, this time, things could be different. Emma? Her sister's voice came through, surprised but warm. It's been a while. Emma smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It has, she replied softly. I thought it was time I checked in. Really checked in. How have you been? The conversation that followed was filled with laughter, with memories, with a closeness she hadn't realized she missed. Her sister shared stories of her children, of family gatherings Emma had missed, and with each word, Emma felt a piece of herself coming back to life. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of something new, something genuine. In the days that followed, Emma began to embrace the small changes that Marcus had inspired in her. She took more time to connect, to listen, to step back from the relentless drive that had once defined her. She started volunteering at a community center nearby, teaching a weekly business class for women looking to start their own ventures. The work was humbling, grounding, a reminder of what success could look like outside of wealth and status. And with each small step, Emma felt herself shedding the old layers, the parts of herself that had once seemed so vital but now felt foreign. She no longer needed to prove her worth to others. She was discovering it within herself. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling class at the community center, Emma found herself thinking of Marcus again. She wondered where he was, if he knew the impact he had left on her, the shift he had inspired. She thought of reaching out, of trying to contact him, but something stopped her. Marcus had given her a gift, but the journey was her own. She didn't need his validation, his acknowledgement. The change he had sparked was now part of her, something she would carry forward. Standing at her window that night, looking out over the city, Emma felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Her life was still the same in many ways. She still had her career, her goals, her responsibilities. But now, there was a balance, a sense of purpose that went beyond the superficial markers she had once chased. She had begun to define her life on her own terms, to fill it with moments that mattered, people who mattered. And as she gazed out at the lights of the city, Emma knew this was just the beginning. She had embarked on a journey of self-discovery, one that would require patience, humility, and courage. But for the first time, she was ready. She was ready to live a life that was true, a life that reflected the person she was becoming. With a final, quiet nod to the memory of the man who had opened her eyes, Emma stepped away from the window, her heart light, her mind clear. She was no longer defined by the assumptions and judgments that had once bound her. She was free to be herself, to choose her path, to create a life that was not only successful but meaningful. And as she turned off the lights and walked toward a new day, Emma felt a sense of peace she had never known. She was finally living a life that was real, and that, she knew, was the greatest success she could ever achieve.